combat boot. In the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers were losing their feet, not to the enemy, but to the boot the army issued them. The skin rotted. Amputations followed. The army knew they had a better design. The war ended before they issued it. For decades, the system never solved the problem. Operators did. A canvas sneaker, $60 today, built for a basketball court. Vietnam, 1965. A Navy SEAL preparing for a shipboarding operation tries to slide his issued jungle boot into a standard military dive fin. It does not fit. He sets it aside. He reaches for a pair of Converse Chuck Taylors, less than $10, built for pickup games. They slide in without resistance. A basketball shoe that cost less than $10 had just outperformed 50 years of American military boot procurement. For an army that large, issuing one standard boot has real supply chain logic. On paper, it is defensible, but the army had the data. Decades later, they had 36,000 soldiers telling them exactly what worked. Their answer? Put the boot in the base store. Make soldiers buy it themselves. Right now, millions of taxpayer dollars keep the descendant of that same failed answer in service. This is that story. 3 wars, the same failure. Different climates, different decades, different enemies. And every time, the army documented the problem, filed the solution, and went into the next conflict with the wrong boot. The shooting stopped. The lesson died with it. 1942. American infantry is fighting in the Pacific. Imagine the environment first. New Guinea, the Philippines, Burma. Triple canopy jungle so dense it blocks the sun at midday. Temperatures above 90 degrees with humidity that never drops. Soldiers moving through flooded undergrowth for days at a time, crossing rivers, wading paddies, navigating terrain where there is no dry ground. Anywhere. The soil is wet. The air is wet. Everything is wet. And the army has sent these men into that environment wearing a leather boot designed on the same logic as a dress shoe. The first thing that goes wrong is not a battle. It is feet. Keep water out, protect the leather, polish regularly. That was the design logic. The jungle guaranteed water would get in, and once it did, there was no way for it to get out. The leather sealed the moisture inside. Soldiers walked for days with wet material continuously pressed against their skin. The result was trench foot. Trench foot is what happens when feet are wet and enclosed long enough. The skin softens, blisters form, circulation fails. In severe cases, the tissue begins to rot inside the boot. Amputation becomes the only answer. It does not appear in battle casualty reports the same way a rifle round does, and it removes soldiers from the fight just as completely. At Guadalcanal, malaria was the dominant medical threat, but foot fungus and skin conditions were one more way the jungle degraded combat strength. Units were losing fighting strength not to enemy fire, to their boots. On paper, the leather boot was durable, standardized, and field-proven. In the field, it was rotting soldiers from the feet up. The army filed the reports and simultaneously began testing something different. An experimental platoon patrolling the Panama Canal Zone in 1942 had reached a conclusion the quartermasters hadn't caught up to. You cannot keep water out of a boot in jungle conditions. Stop trying. Design a boot that gets water out instead. The first jungle boot prototype used a canvas upper, drain eyelets in the lower body, and a more aggressive sole for mud and wet terrain. It reached some Pacific theaters. It arrived too late to be fielded at scale before the war ended. The design worked. The data confirmed it. Both went into the filing system. 5 years later, the army went to Korea. Different climate. Same lesson waiting to be relearned. Korea introduced the opposite failure. Not jungle rot, frostbite. Winter temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with Arctic wind coming down through the north. The same leather boot that had failed in Pacific heat now failed in Korean cold. Army Medical Department analysis confirmed it. Leather combat boots, once wet in those conditions, became frostbite amplifiers. The material retained moisture. The moisture froze. The foot froze with it. Foot conditions accounted for roughly 95% of severe frostbite cases in the Korean theater. The Army's answer was the bunny boot, the white Light Type 2 Extreme Cold Weather Vapor Barrier Boot. Fully rubber, air-insulated, 5 to 6 pounds a pair. It worked for extreme cold. In hot, humid jungle terrain, it was completely useless. On paper, the Army had solved the problem. In practice, they had solved only the last problem. When Korea ended, the bunny boot stayed in the cold weather inventory. The leather combat boot returned as the standard. And 2 years later, in 1955, a conflict began in Vietnam that would define a generation of American military experience. The Army went in with boots designed for the last 2 wars. Neither of them was Vietnam. For the first time in 20 years, the Army actually solved the problem. 1962. Natick Laboratories, the Army's individual soldier research center, and industry partners began field testing direct molded sole construction in Panama. The problem with every previous design was attachment. Stitching, nails, welt construction all fail in sustained wet conditions. In Vietnam-era jungle, a conventionally built boot lasted 4 to 5 weeks before the sole began separating from the upper. Direct molded sole, DMS, worked differently. Liquid rubber was poured into a mold holding the boot upper, setting against every surface and filling every gap to create a bond that was functionally one piece. No stitching at the sole, no nails to rust. The construction point that had been failing in wet conditions was no longer present. In 1962, the first production DMS tropical boots went to U.S. Army Special Forces deploying to Southeast Asia. By 1965, the M1966 Jungle Boot entered full production. Canvas upper, a steel spike-resistant insole against punji stakes, brass drain eyelets near the arch. The drain eyelets were the conceptual reversal from every boot that had come before. Instead of trying to keep water out, water entered and was actively expelled as the soldier moved. The final version adopted the Panama sole, designed by Raymond Doby. Angled square lugs built to force mud outward under pressure rather than letting it accumulate. On previous designs, caked clay added several pounds per boot by mid-patrol. Men were carrying their own environment on their feet, getting slower with every mile. With the Panama sole, the mud shed with each step. The boot stayed near its original weight. There are accounts from Vietnam of soldiers bartering food, ammunition, anything they had for a pair of these boots, even if the size was wrong. Men trading their rations for footwear. That is the most direct performance review a piece of equipment can receive. The medical data underneath this is harder. In some infantry units operating in continuous, wet, lowland terrain, roughly 3/4 of soldiers developed clinically significant foot conditions within their first 4 months in theater. Not from enemy contact, from the equipment on their feet. The 9th Infantry Division, operating in the Mekong Delta, was forced to limit field operations to 48 hours, followed by a mandatory 24-hour stand-down at base camp. The reason was feet. Even the improved jungle boot kept enough moisture against the skin in continuous delta operations that the unit's combat strength degraded within 2 days. Commanders were scheduling combat pauses in the middle of an active war because foot conditions were threatening mission completion. Not from enemy fire, from the boot on the soldier's foot. Natick tested lighter prototypes with better drainage in theater. The improvements were standardized too late. Major U.S. ground combat in Vietnam ended before they could be evaluated at scale. The Army had built the best combat boot in its history. It had documented its limitations, it had begun solving them. Then the war ended, and in peacetime, they undid everything they had built. The jungle boot that emerged from Vietnam was a genuine accomplishment. The DMS construction, the drain eyelets, the Panama sole, the design balanced competing requirements in a way that held up under conditions that had destroyed every boot the Army had previously fielded. Through the 1970s, it remained largely intact. In the 1980s, someone made 2 decisions. The saran mesh ventilating insoles, designed to allow air circulation and support the drainage concept, were replaced with waterproof inserts, a cost decision. The rubber sole compound was reformulated, a facilities decision. The original compound left scuff marks on linoleum floors in stateside bases. Think about that. The insoles that kept soldiers' feet functional in Vietnam rice paddies were swapped out to save money. The sole that gripped jungle terrain was changed so it would not mark up floors. Someone made those calls. One reason was cost. The other was floors. The replacement insoles were waterproof. In a boot that still had drain eyelets, water could still enter and now had nowhere to go. The waterproof insert held it against the foot. The drainage boot had become a water trap. The jungle boot that had kept the 9th Infantry Division fighting was quietly unmade in peacetime by a committee for floors. These were not decisions made in combat. They were made by contractors, optimizing for cost and material convenience, with no feedback loop connecting those choices to what happened in the field. By the time failure reports accumulated, degraded drainage, boots holding moisture instead of releasing it, the contract decisions were several cycles removed from their consequences. The jungle boot's reputation carried the design through Desert Storm. The tan desert combat boot that followed, over 1 million pairs ordered for Kuwait and Iraq, became the cultural standard. The Army combat boot that replaced the jungle boot across the force in the 2000s is its direct descendant. Today, a single multi-year contract for hot weather combat boots carries a maximum value approaching $27 million. Durable, standardized, domestically produced, compliant with every regulation on the books. And 50 years after Vietnam, the operators who needed to board ships at night, move through flooded terrain, or sprint across rooftops in silence were still buying their own footwear. Because the boot the Army issued could not reliably do what those missions required. There was also a law. Federal statute required that every boot sold to the United States military be manufactured in America. The intent was straightforward: protect domestic industry, guarantee quality, ensure that the equipment issued to American soldiers was actually built to American standards. Wellco Enterprises had been a DoD boot supplier for years. Between 2006 and 2012, the Department of Defense paid Wellco over $138 million for combat boots. During that same period, Wellco was secretly having boot uppers manufactured in China. The scheme worked like this. The Chinese factory sewed American flags and USA labels directly onto the boots before shipping. When U.S. Customs detained 2 shipments for deceptive labeling, Wellco executives ordered a different approach: tear-away, made in China tags sewn into the boot uppers, with instructions for workers at the Tennessee facility to physically rip those tags out before the boots shipped to government buyers. The boots were then submitted with false certifications claiming they were 100% compliant with American manufacturing law, and in at least one documented case, certified as meeting safety standards the boots had never been tested against. In September 2016, a federal grand jury indicted 6 former Wellco executives and managers. All 6 eventually pleaded guilty. Vincent Lee Ferguson, the chief executive officer, was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. The law said American-made. The labels said American-made. The boots were made in China. The CEO went to prison. The procurement system that had issued those boots kept running. The operators who depended on that system had stopped waiting for it to catch up. For Navy SEALs, the answer was already on the shelf at a sporting goods store. Picture what a maritime boarding operation actually involves. Dark water, a ship hull rising out of the ocean at night, dive fins on your feet. You surface from the water and the hull is in front of you. Steel, wet, vertical. You reach for a caving ladder, narrow metal rungs, every surface slick. You climb in darkness. You reach the deck. Everything is wet metal. And then, within seconds, you are moving fast toward a target. For For the SEAL who trained and operated in that environment, every piece of equipment was evaluated against one question. Does this help me get from the water to the objective without slowing me down or getting me killed? The SEAL who set his jungle boot aside in 1965 was not making a statement. He was answering that question. Navy SEALs operated in riverine environments that pushed the jungle boot past its design limits. River insertions, amphibious approaches, maritime boarding operations on vessels in contested water. For those missions, the jungle boot had a specific failure that no construction improvement had addressed. It was tall. Its leather upper retained water once flooded, and it did not fit cleanly into standard military dive fins, the fundamental requirement of every over-the-beach operation. Transitioning from water insertion to land movement meant either moving in fins, stopping to change footwear at the objective threshold, or moving through the target in a boot that sloshed audibly with every step. So they wore Chuck Taylors. A shoe engineered for a basketball court in 1917 turned out to solve a problem military engineers hadn't resolved by 1965. Not by design, but because a basketball shoe and a dive fin reward exactly the same thing: a narrow, low-profile foot. SEAL officer Mike Sorrell has described the operational logic on the record. The Chuck Taylor's narrow last fits cleanly into standard military dive fins. No resistance, no adjustment, no delay at the waterline. An operator transitions from swimming to land movement in the same footwear. No issued combat boot offers that. Once ashore, the flat, thin sole provides tactile feedback on ship decks, ladder rungs, and wet metal. Surfaces where feeling the ground in darkness determines whether the next rung holds or whether you fall. The canvas drained through the metal eyelets as the operator walked. By the time a SEAL reached a ship's deck, most of the water had been expelled through movement alone. A leather combat boot flooded the same way and held the water for hours, squishing with every step in an environment where noise discipline is not optional. In jungle and riverine terrain, there was a secondary benefit the issued boot could never offer. A canvas sneaker left no boot print. In environments where locals walked barefoot or in sandals, a combat boot track marked the path of an American operator. A Chuck Taylor left nothing to distinguish. Military.com has reported that Navy SEALs are actually issued all-black Converse Chuck Taylors as functional maritime footwear, not improvised, not purchased through back channels, issued. The all-black colorway specifically, for the same reason operators paint their faces before a night mission: reduced visual signature. The U.S. Navy issued a canvas basketball sneaker that cost less than $10 to its most capable maritime operators because the procurement system, with its multi-year contracts approaching tens of millions of dollars per award, had not produced a boot optimized for the same performance. And that logic was not uniquely American. Other elite units solving similar mission problems converged on the same answer: lighter, lower-profile footwear outside the standard boot system. The sneaker story did not stay at the waterline. In dense urban environments, the direct action operations that defined Iraq and Afghanistan, operators faced a different problem: building clearing at night, stairwell movement, rooftop approaches, short explosive sprints through narrow spaces where the margin between heard and unheard decides who fires first. The standard combat boot is designed for dismounted patrol over rough terrain, heavy sole, rigid construction, tall ankle. On hard floors, concrete and metal, the actual surfaces of an urban objective, it is loud. The lugged rubber sole against tile or concrete announces movement. A room that should have been a surprise becomes a warning. Sneakers do not make that sound. Lighter, faster acceleration, quieter footfall. In environments where being heard before being seen is the primary threat, the footwear that reduces noise is operationally superior, regardless of what the uniform regulation says about minimum ankle height. Open-source imagery of Delta Force, Rangers, and Special Forces units across 2 decades of Iraq and Afghanistan consistently shows operators in commercial footwear, trail runners, mid-height hiking boots, low-cut tactical shoes, not standard-issue Army combat boots. A coherent operational logic the procurement system had not built a standard-issue answer for. The contrast is structural. The conventional Army boot procurement system exists to equip hundreds of thousands of soldiers across multiple climates with standardized items at the lowest defensible cost. That logic is not irrational. Standardization simplifies the supply chain and ensures every soldier in a formation shows up to the same standard. It also cannot solve the fin compatibility problem. It cannot solve the noise on hard floors problem. It cannot engineer the drainage performance the 9th Infantry Division was scheduling combat pauses over in 1968. Not because the engineering is beyond the Army, because the criteria driving the procurement system do not weight those requirements heavily enough to change the output. SOCOM built a parallel track. The Tora Bora mountain boot, developed for special operations forces in Afghan mountain terrain, went from requirement to fielded product in approximately 1 year. SOCOM worked directly with manufacturers, accepted specific trade-offs for a specific mission, and moved at a pace the conventional procurement system cannot sustain. Soldiers under the conventional system largely made do or bought their own. Operators under the SOCOM model got a fielded solution in 1 year. And it was not just operators. In 2019, the Army's own research center published the results of a survey of over 14,000 soldiers worldwide. Almost 50% had stopped wearing their issued boots and were purchasing their own commercial alternatives. Lighter, more flexible, less break-in time, more like athletic shoes. Half the Army buying their own boots. The Army's own data confirmed it. Nothing changed. In the 2000s, as Pacific Command refocused attention on jungle and tropical environments, the Army initiated the Jungle Combat Boot Program. The 25th Infantry Division, based in Hawaii, regularly deployed across the Pacific, served as the primary test formation. 36,708 pairs were ordered. 2 brigade combat teams field-tested them through multiple phases in 2017 and 2018. The feedback was consistent across both rounds. First-generation designs were too stiff and caught on undergrowth during movement. Second-generation designs were lighter, more flexible, dried significantly faster after water crossings, and provided better traction on wet terrain. Soldiers who wore them preferred them substantially over standard-issue Army combat boots for jungle operations. The data was not ambiguous. In September 2017, the Army Uniform Board reviewed the results. Here is what it took to get to that meeting. The Army's own procurement guidelines allow 926 days, almost 3 years, to deliver any piece of equipment to a soldier. Not a weapon system, not a vehicle, a boot. Anyone in the world can buy boots in 3 days. The Army's own system allows for 926. At the end of 926 days, the Uniform Board had 36,000 field-tested pairs, 2 full rounds of soldier feedback, and a clear answer. Their decision? Put it in the base store. Make soldiers buy it themselves, with their own money, at prices between $180 and $210. While continuing to spend $27 million on the boot those same soldiers had just told them they actively hated. Military.com reported on this at the time. When reporters asked why the Army chose not to issue the Jungle Combat Boot, despite the testing, the 36,000 pairs, the clear soldier preference, uniform officials could not provide an explanation. Not a classified rationale, not a budget argument, not a logistics constraint they could name. No explanation. The Army had run one of the most operationally grounded boot evaluations in its history. Clear results, and the outcome was a shelf at the base exchange. This decision was made in September 2017. Soldiers assigned to Pacific units today purchase their own jungle boots. The institutional logic that produced the 9th Infantry Division's 48-hour combat pause had not changed its fundamental calculation in 50 years. The data data changed, the soldiers changed, the terrain changed. The answer stayed the same. And while the Army was routing the jungle combat boot to the base store, a company that had been making military boots since 1969 was having a different kind of meeting. Altama is a U.S. military footwear manufacturer. They have been making military boots since 1969, through Vietnam, through Desert Storm, through every era of American military footwear procurement. They were building military boots when the saran mesh insoles were replaced with waterproof inserts because of floor scuffing. They were building military boots when the jungle combat boot was routed to the base store. In the 2010s, Altama sat down with Navy SEALs in Virginia Beach and Coronado. They didn't need 926 days. They didn't need a $27 million contract. They sat down with the operators, asked what 50 years of procurement had failed to ask, and solved the problem in one collaboration. The design brief was explicit. Take everything operators value about the Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star and add what actual amphibious warfare requires. The SEALs explained what the Chuck Taylor did that no issued boot reliably replicated: the fin fit, the drainage rate, the tactile feedback on wet metal, the weight, the silence. Altama built around those answers. The result was the OTB Maritime Assault Boot, over the beach. Rubber outsole compound formulated for grip on wet metal surfaces. Rapid drain construction through the upper. Lightweight nylon, replacing canvas. A protective shank for structural integrity. Built-in compatibility with standard military dive fins. The Altama Maritime Assault Mid weighs approximately 27 ounces per pair. The standard Army combat boot, the one from the $27 million contracts, weighs approximately 60 ounces per pair. Weight on the feet costs more than the same weight carried on the back. It is documented in military biomechanics research. Foot mass increases the energetic cost of movement more directly than torso-carried weight does. Research going back to the 1980s suggests the penalty is roughly 5 to 1. 1 pound on the foot costing as much metabolically as 5 pounds carried on the back. In fast-paced, short-duration missions, boarding a ship, clearing a building, moving quickly through a city, operators carrying 27 ounces instead of 60 arrive at the objective with more left in reserve. The Altama Maritime Assault Mid costs approximately $100 to $130 retail. The failure this boot represents is precise. It is not that one boot can serve every soldier in every situation. No single boot can. The failure is that the system could not provide even this one specific boot for the operators who specifically needed it. A commercial company, in one conversation, solved what 926 days of procurement hadn't produced in 50 years. A company with over 50 years of U.S. military footwear experience sat down with the operators who had been buying canvas sneakers for 50 years, asked what those sneakers did that issued boots couldn't, and built the answer. That is the product the Jungle Combat Boot program did not produce. That is the answer that 36,000 field-tested pairs and documented soldier preference did not result in fielding. The Chuck Taylor All-Star that Navy SEALs first picked up in Vietnam cost less than $10 in 1965. Today, it costs around $60. The purpose-built, militarized version, made by a company that has manufactured military boots for over 50 years, costs $100. The object changed. The gap did not. Go back to the opening image. A combat boot, issued to every soldier in some form since the Second World War. 4 pounds, standardized, domestically produced, procured through contracts worth nearly $27 million per award, reviewed by contracting offices, tested to specification, compliant with every regulation on the books. And, sitting next to it, in the gear bag of the most capable maritime operators the U.S. military fields, a canvas sneaker. $60. Available at any department store. Chosen because the procurement system had not produced a boot optimized for what those operators actually needed. The Army has never fully gotten this right. Not because the engineering was beyond them. The jungle boot proved they could solve the problem when the casualty rate forced the issue. Not because the data was unavailable. Vietnam, Korea, the Pacific all produced documented failures in real time, in reports that went into filing systems. Because the system that procures boots for hundreds of thousands of soldiers optimizes for what it can standardize, not for what works in the worst situations. Every war produced the data. Every procurement cycle found reasons not to act on it. The Altama Maritime Assault Boot is available to any operator who wants to purchase it. It is not standard issue. The Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star is still available too. It costs $60. And the system that hasn't matched it is still signing contracts and issuing boots to the largest ground force in the world. Same feet, same gap, same answer sitting on a shelf. If this made you want to go deeper, the 2 books that shaped this video are linked in the description. And so is the vault, where I keep all the raw research and source documents behind every video. Subscribe for more.